Hi, and thanks for watching the Anti-Capitalist Podcast Network. I'm Craig, host of Voices from the Left podcast, one of the founders of the network. I'm also joined by our other founder, Jordan, who's the host of 805 Uncensored podcast, and Heather, who's also a host of the 805 Uncensored podcast. Hi, comrades. Thanks for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Hey.
So just for the listeners or viewers' sake, we're going to chat about the origins of the network a little bit and then end with a discussion about climate change and intersectionality. So I'll start. I wanted to join a network of like-minded hosts to collaborate, grow my audience, and work outside the capitalist power structures to create community. And I thought about it for a while, but didn't really find an existing network that appealed to me. So I'd been on Jordan's show and Heather's show a couple times and knew we had similar interests. So I asked him if he'd like to create the network with me, and he enthusiastically agreed. And so here we are. So Jordan, why don't you tell us why you thought this was a good idea?
Sure. Yeah. So similar to Craig, I became interested in creating this network to expand my reach, foster a sense of community among the left, um, gather with other content creators in person and online spaces. And, just lastly, because we're under late stage capitalism, rapidly deteriorating material conditions for a significant portion of our population. And so it's ideal for us to work together to seek solutions because we've got really big problems to face.
Right on. So without further ado, we'll jump right in here. So I pulled some info here from Wikipedia about intersectionality. And I'll just start with the quick definition. So intersectionality is a sociological analytical framework for understanding how groups and individuals' social and political identities result in unique combinations of discrimination and privilege. Examples of these factors include gender, caste, sex, race, ethnicity, class, sexuality, religion, disability, height, age, weight, and physical appearance. These intersecting and overlapping social identities may both be empowering and oppressing. However, little good quality quantitative research has been done to support or undermine the practical uses of intersectionality. It's not to say it doesn't exist and isn't important. It's just certain people are just coming around, I think, to understand why it's important to look at. Just as an example, intersectionality broadens the scope of the first and second waves of feminism, which largely focused on the experiences of women who were white, middle class, to include the different experiences of women of color, poor women, immigrant women, and other groups. Intersectional feminism aims to separate itself from white feminism by acknowledging women's differing experiences and identities. So again, this is from Wikipedia, and if someone was excluded from this article, I apologize, but that's the point we're trying to get, is that we need to make sure we're identifying these things and making sure we're cognizant of them so that we can, lift, so a rising tide can lift all boats, right? Not just some, so to speak. So with that, I will turn it over to, well, first I'll ask Heather if she has anything she wants to add.
Yeah, actually, I've been thinking about this quite a bit lately, because I think intersectionality offers us a perfect example, and I love that your definition talks about the limitation of, or the limited amount of good quality quantitative data. And I think that intersectionality gives us like a perfect example about how limiting quantitative data is, or research is overall, in solving problems. And like politics and society and like social issues, like you can't like cherry pick these little data points and solve it all, right? And I think that qualitative research goes much, much further. But we don't have that. We don't have that at all on women, race, gender, identity. We don't have that at all. And I think intersectionality just highlights perfectly that that's where we need to go, because politics is not linear by any stretch of the imagination. And intersectionality is the perfect, uh, defining thing to me that evidence is that for us.
Sure. Yeah, that's excellent. Jordan, anything you want to add?
No, just super well said, and I think it translates well into the next topic, which is using intersectionality as a solution to overcome the ecological crisis facing us right now. As for a definition for climate change in common usage, climate change describes global warming, the ongoing increase in global average temperature, and its effects on Earth's climate system. Climate change, in a broader sense, also includes previous long-term changes to Earth's climate, and the current rise in global average temperature is primarily caused by humans burning fossil fuels since the Industrial Revolution. Climate change, of course, threatens people with increased flooding, extreme heat, increased food and water scarcity, more disease, and economic loss. Human migration and conflict can also be a result of the climate crisis, and the World Health Organization calls climate change the greatest threat to global health in the 21st century. Poorer communities around the world are responsible for a small share of global emissions, yet they tend to suffer the greatest consequences. Again, majority of these emissions are coming from wealthy capitalist countries, and these communities are especially vulnerable to the consequences of climate change and have been forced to relocate from places that they've lived on for thousands of years. As the climate crisis relates to gender disparities, women everywhere from North America to Africa are disproportionately impacted by climate change, whether that means deepening existing inequality or exposing them to the threat of gender-based violence. Intersectionality can help us understand better how and why some groups of women are more impacted than others. And by using intersectionality, we can give women a place at the table and catalyze meaningful action on the climate crisis. So I have a source now that I pulled up from the World Economic Forum, which admittedly I understand is, based in the West and could be slightly slanted, but I read through this quite a few times and I really feel like they had some great information. So it says here, to make matters worse as it stands, women carry out 75% of unpaid care work around the world. This gap is projected to widen as climate-induced disasters increase in frequency. Social norms and prescribed gender roles often dictate to women the need to fend for their families, which further exacerbates differences between unpaid work in the household. The combination of climate change and gender inequity threatens to further exacerbate the resource and time poverty that women all over the world are subjected to. This in turn will undermine girls' education as they're forced to drop out of school to help out with household chores or be forcibly married or other extremely negative outcomes to keep the family supported and afloat. And this also compromises women's health. In times of acute crisis, gender-based violence rises, as does economic vulnerability, as what's referred to as a threat multiplier. So the climate crisis has been closely related to the increased risk of sexual, mental, and economic abuse for women. And extreme weather events like droughts culminate in elongating the trek women must take to do things like fetch water and food for their families or use for toilets. This makes them more susceptible to sexual abuse and sexual exploitation in exchange for clean water, as well as being subjected to things like human trafficking. In 2021, in Somalia, women experienced some of those impacts where horrifically many incidences of gang rape were reported as a byproduct of the culminating conflicts and social tension because of the drought driven by the climate crisis. So let's just take a step back and think about this, right? So to better understand this, think about the intersectional identities that women hold around the world. Obviously, women are not going to be all impacted the same. A rich white woman in the West is not going to be impacted like a poor black woman in Somalia. So, and it's really important to keep that in mind, because if you forget this, it can have a really detrimental impact on the fight against climate change. So incorporating diverse views, especially Black, Brown, and Indigenous, is imperative in order to solve these problems related to the climate crisis. And if we don't, we're not going to make any serious, meaningful action on it. Kind of want to switch gears here a little bit and now talk about. Actually, you know what, Heather, you want to add anything real quick before I say this?
Yeah, I think a great example that a lot of people in the West can identify with on the way that women have to bear the disproportionate burden of climate disruption is with COVID. Look at what women in the United States had to deal with, especially in states like California, when schools were closed. Schools were closed, and this is unfortunate because it became a right-wing talking point, right? Is that, we're being locked down because we have this climate-driven pandemic disease. And all of a sudden, you had women having to work from home while simultaneously educating their children from home as well. And then another thing that we now know is that that pandemic disease impacts women more severely. Pregnant women and their unborn babies are disproportionately impacted by it. And again, COVID is a climate driven disease. And so I think that is a perfect example of what you're talking about. And while I don't mean to like equate, white women in the West as suburban moms or whatever with, people that are, really struggling in third world countries. But I think it's an attainable example for a lot of people because they experienced it. And I think once you start to talk to people about their experience, they're able to then understand what people in, say, Somalia are experiencing, even, tenfold. So that's all I wanted to add.
Yeah, no, perfect. Thank you for that. That's excellent.
For sure. And I want to touch on something too that you talked about early on, and that was the unpaid care work in particular. Yes. So there's a really good discussion about this in one of Angela Davis's works, Women, Race, and Class. She talks extensively about how trying to, she went from basically like the early days of the suffrage movement, and how when, primarily the women were always the caregiver, right? Because the men were working, and, they were always doing that work. And there was talk of, getting income, to families that had that. I mean, pretty much all families back then did, but like, there was a lot of talk of how, that's unpaid work that women are doing so that their husbands can go work in a factory or work in an office or whatever the case is, right? And it's still going on now, of course. And she talks about it much more eloquently than I just ham-fisted my way through, but it's worth a read if you haven't read it. And it starts, of course, with talking about even before the suffrage movement with slavery, and how the difference in genders and race in that case were, the disparities there. So it's a really good book for people to try and understand that particular part of it better.
Yeah, to follow up on that, I just saw yesterday a video, and I left working for anyone else. I went into freelancing in 2009, and I've had long stretches where I've done no work at all except for raising my kids. And I just saw yesterday a video, I think it was on TikTok or Instagram Reels, where this economist estimated that if his wife was being paid for the work she was doing as a stay-at-home wife and mother of their like 2 kids, she would be paid over $200,000 a year for all the work that you do. And it's true. Women do have a disproportionate amount of care work, and it's all unpaid. All unpaid.
So, for the listeners out there that aren't aware, Heather and I live in Ventura County, which happens to be the fastest warming county in the lower 48 states, and neighboring Santa Barbara, which is immediately to our north, is second. So it's quite shocking. The climate crisis is near and dear to Heather and I. I recently read something. Actually, I'll just back up a little bit. In California, what our type of climate change that we're experiencing, scientists are calling climate whiplash, which means that you're getting very sudden changes from things like extreme drought to oversaturation of the ground from flooding. And what's referred to as the shoulder season in California, where you transition from the rainy season into summer, is shrinking. Also, in the fall months, wildfire season is expanding, and the seasons are being impacted by this climate whiplash. And there was a new study that was released by a climate scientist from University of California, Santa Barbara, that said, when referring to the Montecito mudslides, it was a compound event such as those in Montecito, so a firestorm, the Thomas Fire, followed in short order by a torrential downpour that came in January the following year. Because, of course, the Thomas Fire was at the end of 2017, burned through Christmas into the early part of January of 2018. And it says this will become increasingly frequent this century in California and the West. The modeling studies showed that the frequency of such compound events will increase by 100% this century in California, up to 700% in the Pacific Northwest. She says, I'm a relatively recent transplant. She arrived in the fall of 2017. The reason that's important is because that's 2 months before the Thomas Fire. And she says, keep in mind, this is a climate scientist. This is not somebody that's just giving us her opinion. She's an expert. So she says, I know something about wildfire after living in Colorado, but after that happened, oh my God, California wildfires are a whole different animal. Heather, you have anything you want to say about any of this? I feel like you do.
Well, a whole different animal, I just think, is an understatement. They create their own weather.
Firestorms.
They create their own. Our wildfires are they're, I don't even think there's a word to describe them. And you have to be to experience it to believe it.
Well, this is our era, the Pyrocene, driven by anthropogenic climate change and settler colonialism, the theft of indigenous lands, and because of that, the prevention of things like prescribed burns because of settlements. And centuries go by and you've got all this underbrush that grows. We've got all kinds of forests across the West that are entirely unhealthy, packed with trees that shouldn't be there because they should have been burned. So I digress, though. I'll start talking about the importance of environmental intersectionality. So the application of an intersectional lens is essential when it comes to properly addressing the scale of the climate crisis. And I would say that no meaningful action on the crisis will be taken unless diverse perspectives are incorporated. So that's Black, Brown, Indigenous, but also the LGBTQ community and the Two-Spirit community. They're frequently left out of these conversations, and they shouldn't be. They need to be. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to tackle these problems we face. And lastly, with regards to land back, there's no climate justice without land back, and a fundamental restructuring of the way our society examines our natural world. In 21st century civilization, it's relatively simple to look at human beings as utterly disconnected from our environment, but this is nothing but an illusion. And lastly, I've got a book recommendation for the listeners, which is Leah Thomas's The Intersectional Environmentalist.
Very cool.
Anything you want to add, Heather, before I pass it over to Craig? Great. Thank you.
All right. So we go from one uplifting topic to another. This is racial disparities in climate change. And this is the information here. I got paraphrasing essentially from a study done by the National Institutes of Health, which is in the United States, of course. Dr. Fauci worked there for anyone who still doesn't know who that is, but that's where he used to work. I think he's retired now. At any rate, the article is titled "Racial Disparities in Climate Change Related Health Effects in the United States." So multiple studies of heat, extreme cold, hurricanes, flooding, and wildfires find evidence that people of color, including Black, Latinx, Native American, Pacific Islander, and Asian communities are at a higher risk of climate-related health impacts than whites, although this is not always the case. But studies of adults have found evidence of racial disparities related to climatic changes with respect to mortality, respiratory and cardiovascular disease, mental health, and heat-related illness. Children are particularly vulnerable to the health impacts of climate change, and infants and children of color have experienced adverse perinatal outcomes, occupational heat stress, and increases in emergency department visits associated with extreme weather. Racially and socioeconomically marginalized communities in the United States have been shown to experience greater impacts from storm and flood events, extreme heat, and infectious diseases that are becoming more frequent due to climate change. So that kind of solidifies what Heather said earlier about COVID being a climate event, right? Or exacerbated by climate change, right? Jordan, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, going back to what I said about compounding events, COVID and the wildfire crisis, one of the images that really stood out to me during COVID was when there was that photograph, and Heather probably knows what I'm talking about, of warning about masks and social distancing. And then in the background, approaching the sign, was a wildfire. And then all these studies that came out after the wildfire crisis went through the West that year in Oregon and California, we saw these premature deaths from the smoke exposure. So I just wanted to add that last bit.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Well, and people that have been exposed, I think Jordan, you're the one who told me this, people that have been exposed to the wildfire smoke and pesticides also are more likely to still get seriously ill with COVID. And something that, when we're talking about heat related illness as we're heading into the summer, you're seeing a lot of like organizations now that are advocating for policies to protect, especially like Latino farm workers from heat driven illness. But I feel like politicians and the government are already doing the same thing they've done with COVID, which is make it all about individual responsibility. Because as soon as that conversation starts, like in the media about driving policy to protect workers, as one example, you start seeing, oh, well, here's what you can do to protect yourself from heat illness. It's not our responsibility. And that gets back to capitalism, right? Which is, corporations who effectively own the government, feeling like they have no responsibility to protect workers, even when we know that they are the ones that are going to be harmed the most.
And what is
And
capitalism?
are being harmed the most.
But what is capitalism but just the exaggeration and the normalization of human suffering?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and to your point about, places being, or the government being owned by corporations, we're seeing it right now, Heather, in Florida. And I think a couple other states, but Florida for sure. where they removed regulation that says people have to have breaks in the summer and during heat have to have water breaks. I think Texas too, which would be no surprise. But like, you know, in addition to, you know, DeSantis and Abbott being owned by capital, they also are horrible people on top of it. Right. Right. So like they don't need capital's help most of the time just because they're terrible people. Right. And
Yeah.
then capital gets involved and it's just like, oh, that's just one horrible, just, you know,
An added layer of moral bankruptcy.
yeah, an orgy of moral bankruptcy.
And I mean, it's not even exclusive to like big corporations either. We're seeing now with this bird flu, which is another climate driven pandemic disease, that you're starting to see rifts between the farm workers who want to get the PPE to protect themselves from the poultry and the cattle that have the bird flu, the H5N1, and then the farm owners that don't want to give it to them. They don't even want to pay for like masks and
Right.
PPE for these people that are now getting. I mean, you're seeing people get very seriously ill, farm workers on these farms, and these even small time. I mean, here in Ventura County, we are an agriculture community. We have a lot of small time local farms, and they don't want to put out anything to protect their workers from heat, disease, nothing, because it costs them. It affects their bottom line in the end.
Capital.
Yeah.
Jordan's got his hand raised.
Yeah, just one more thing. There was actually a study released in California from the years of 2008 to 2018 that stated in California alone, over 50,000 people were killed prematurely because of wildfires, just in that 10-year period. And,
Insanity.
majority of that is not the direct flames, that's smoke exposure.
Sure. And I think I haven't read that particular thing, but I'm guessing it's not just like, oh, there's smoke wafting through my area and I'm breathing it in. It's getting in the atmosphere, right? And causing issues that you can't even necessarily see that affect people's respiratory issues, right?
Exactly. The particulate, I'm not an expert in air quality, but the particulates are so small.
Yeah.
They
Well, and also, sorry.
they pierce the lungs. And to Craig's point, you can't see them. You don't even know that they necessarily exist at times.
Well, and also starting with the Thomas Fire, we're seeing more and more wildfires that are going through populated areas. And so you're not just breathing smoke, that went through trees. You're breathing someone's, melted TV, and computers and electronics. And uh, that's, I think, where we're all really getting screwed, because we're literally like putting PFAS into the air, right?
Right.
um and not much you could do about it.
And I mean, this is the issue of rapid development in what's referred to as the wildland urban interface.
Hmm.
This is the transitionary zone where you've got human development that brushes up against wildlands, which have had wildfire for a millennia. So it's not even necessarily that wildfires are getting closer to us. We're literally getting closer to them,
Right.
where they've always been.
Yeah.
And
Right.
getting back to that point about, the research and the data. I've been thinking about, and this is not a wildfire, but here in Oxnard, where Jordan and I live, on the night of the primary, the old Sunkist factory burned down. And in the immediate area, called La Colonia, um, we we could smell the the chemicals and all the stuff that was in the structure, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
probably asbestos and all kinds of, terrible chemicals. Well, the city and the fire department and the health department, they had no way to even know what was in the air, really, because they were relying on, limited amounts of data. And we have so few studies on like what's in these buildings and what happens when you burn through it. But you could smell it. You could smell it. But the city officials were just like, oh, well, what is it called? ppm, the particulates in the air. Oh, well, they're above this, so it's okay, don't worry about it. You don't have to wear a mask, you don't have to like not go to work. It's fine. But it was clearly not fine. uh and all the building materials are still out there, just burned up, not cleaned up. And then extrapolate that out into a wildfire that goes through an entire community, like the Thomas fire. What do you think is going to come up 10 or 20 years from now, that people are sick with from that? Because I mean,
Yeah.
we were breathing people's TVs.
Right.
That, you know,
That's crazy. And, there's already studies, a couple of different studies that have shown microplastics everywhere.
The
Right.
top of Mount Everest, the bottom of the Mariana Trench.
Right. They're in the ocean. They're in people's lungs. They're in children's lungs when they're born.
They're in sperm.
Right. Right. You want to get a white dude to care about microplastics. Tell him his balls won't work anymore. But yeah, it's like, it's so fucked.
Yeah. And to your point about you mentioned the mudslides after the Thomas fire, that was the same thing. I mean, you had weeks of people breathing in whatever that fire went through, and then the mudslides washed it all down into the water supply.
Jesus. Good Lord.
And that was a climate driven event.
Right. Yeah. Oh man. All right. Well, that all ties in with the rest of this about health disparities. So, the climate, the more frequent climate change affects, children's physiology and dependence on others for basic needs. Makes them vulnerable, right? And collectively, this raises concerns that climate change will exacerbate existing social and economic inequalities and worsen racialized health disparities among children and adults, right? And in this case, health disparities refer to systemic, plausibly avoidable health differences that adversely affect racially and socioeconomically marginalized groups. And in this particular study, they note that they focus on racial, ethnic health disparities that disproportionately impact people of color who experience social marginalization due to systemic racism and the legacy of race-based discrimination in the USA. So the impacts of temperature on racial health disparities have been examined in more than a dozen states across the country and in many nationwide studies. For example, workers of color are also suffering greater heat-related illnesses, i.e. heat rash, heat stroke, heat exhaustion, and death. In particular, Hispanics are overrepresented in industries with high heat mortality risk, including agricultural and construction. Heat stress has also been found to impact dermal and pulmonary absorption of chemicals, so breathing it and absorbing it through your skin, and that when those chemicals the toxicity of those chemicals are exacerbated by the heat stress, and it compounds the risk of illness associated with hazardous substance exposures among workers. It's just horrible things. Just, also, in addition or furthermore, Blacks and Hispanics have also been shown to experience greater adverse mental health related outcomes like anxiety, psychosis, and substance use disorders, as measured by emergency department visits and self-reported symptoms associated with temperature, both heat and cold, as compared to whites. Yeah, this is This is unbelievable. I mean, I believe it, but it's like, it's just one of those things that it's like, what, you know, people will ignore that these things don't happen, that there are no systemic issues, right? In the United States in particular, but obviously anywhere you have capitalism, but they like to deny it, especially in the United States. Um, Children are particularly vulnerable to climate related health impacts like allergies, asthma, infectious diseases, PTSD, malnutrition, and poor perinatal outcomes. Excuse me. Children are more vulnerable since they are still developing cognitively, physically, and physiologically and have limited ability to care for themselves. Right. So, you know, especially if you're infant up to, I don't know, 7, 8, maybe 10, they can't get, they don't know enough. For one, if you're really little, you can't cover your mouth, even can't pull your shirt up over your mouth as the most basic form of trying to block out a smoke, right? Or particulates or something you're not supposed to be breathing in, right? Whereas once kids get to be 7, 8 years old, they're just outside running around all day long, right? They're not, unless you make them wear a mask all the time, they're not, you know, they can't, they aren't going to care for themselves that way, right? And lastly, for this particular thing, climate change is also contributing to colder winter weather in some parts of the country, which won't be a surprise to a lot of people. Two national studies spanning from 1999 to 2018 found that American Indians and Alaska Natives had the highest mortality rate associated with extreme cold compared to whites. And a study in Virginia found that groups of color categorized as non-white were at higher risk of emergency department visits than whites due to cold weather conditions. So it's not just heat, right? It's cold. And anyone who's spent, lived in a northern state where it snows a lot, especially if you're in the plain states, it's so damn cold. Like it's like brutally cold. It's horrible. And you have people experiencing homelessness that don't have anywhere to go. Maybe they don't have the means to get to a shelter, right? Or the shelter kicks them out, or who knows what other horrible things happen, right? It's just bad news all the way around, unfortunately. Looks like Jordan has his hand raised.
Yeah, I was just going to point out, the climate crisis can be really confusing to some people because of the sheer counterintuitiveness it has at times. So it's easy for people to think, right, like we have extreme cold, so how could this be happening? How could we be having global warming? But actually, the severity and frequency of the polar vortex in the northern states has increased because of the climate crisis, and they think it's because of large-scale ice sheets melting in the Arctic. Craig, you're on mute.
Boomer on mute. So, and more to your point about the extreme weather, especially the cold weather, like climate change, and to the people that say, well, how can we have global warming when it's still cold out, right? Or it's -20 here. How can we have global warming? The greenhouse gas effect, for those that were around before they changed it to climate change, makes erratic weather, right? That's the point of it, right? Yes, it heats it up. It heats up the overall temperature of the earth, but that leads to more erratic weather, larger temperature swings, right? Stuff like we experienced here in Wisconsin, where it was like 70 one day and like 15 the next, like huge temperature swings, right? That has not happened that I remember in my lifetime. I've lived here my whole life. So that is bonkers shit when you start seeing temperature swings like that. And people like to make jokes about it probably everywhere, but particularly in the Midwest. It's a Wisconsin winter or whatever if it wasn't, 2 feet of snow today and, 60 tomorrow. But that is actually happening, right? And it's worse now than it was when I was a kid. So it's not false. I know it. I've lived it.
I think that there also, though, is a really big problem with, Western exceptionalism or American exceptionalism, where we tend to think that it's not going to happen to us, right? And I was just thinking about when you were talking about, um, you know, Black and brown communities being disproportionately impacted by climate events. In 2022, there was a study done about back to COVID, um, about white Americans' attitudes towards the virus, and they unequivocally stopped being concerned when they found out that Black and brown communities got it worse. And
Right.
that just you're talking about systemic issues that we have. I mean, that's going to be a tough nut to crack because people just don't give a shit if they think that it's not going to impact them. And so we have, our built-in racism, right?
Yep. Hmm.
Plus American exceptionalism, plus the cognitive dissonance of, oh, well, if it's warming, how is it getting colder?
Yeah, right.
Um, and so this is a very complex problem uh, to address.
Yeah, and then you have, the factor of mass migration, which is
Hmm.
inevitably going to lead to eco-fascism.
Hmm. Definitely. Well, and to your point about COVID and people not, um, believing it until they experience it themselves, quote unquote. Like, I remember from 2020 seeing articles come out or even just short clips from nurses and other healthcare people saying we had people lying in the hospital in their beds saying they didn't believe COVID was a
Yeah.
thing. And like at the end, they're drowning in their own, fluid.
Yeah.
And not only then they admit that, oh yeah, COVID's real. Like I didn't believe it and I got sick. And it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, that's exactly what you're talking about, I think, with that American exceptionalism. Like, it's an empathy thing, right? You
Yeah.
can't they can't those people couldn't possibly think that, just step outside themselves for a minute to think about how something like that impacting someone else could impact them, right?
Yeah. Right before COVID, I think it was 2018 or 2019, Scientific American had a really, really good piece about America's empathy deficit. And so this was pre-COVID, but scientists were starting to recognize and kind of start to wrap their heads around this surmounting problem of Americans just not giving a shit about anybody else but themselves. And I think that living in climate change, um, it's kind of putting, what is the thing called, a magnifying glass? It's putting a magnifying glass on the problem. Uh, but I don't see anybody making any moves either to correct that fundamental issue of empathy or lack thereof.
Yeah, well, and that's capitalism in general, right? Capitalism kills empathy. And, you have a hard pressed time finding a more capitalist place on the face of the earth than the United States. Like, our fucking politicians have and perfected it in a bad way, right? And then, destroyed the planet and its life forms in the process. Um, all right. So, uh, as we just talked about, climate change has a disproportionate effect on historically marginalized groups. We know what the solution is, right? That's curbing fossil fuel production, you know, helping lift people out of poverty, amongst other things. But the greed of the chauvinists and white supremacists of the capitalist class around the world stands in the way of fixing this. And you know, it's already been shown that what they're doing is harmful and they don't care and they just keep doing it, right? And they do it intentionally, right? By obscuring facts. We've seen articles about ExxonMobil obscuring facts since like the late or the early 80s, right? About their impact, right?
I think 77.
Was it
The
that?
late
Was it the late
70s.
70s? Yeah. So it's like, it's so just, they know what they're doing. They don't care because it's at the end of the day, it's not going to affect them like it's going to affect the rest of us, in particular, the capitalist class, right? Because if
Yeah.
anybody can pay money to prevent terrible things from happening to them, it's the capitalist class, right? While the rest of us, you know,
At our expense.
right, at our expense, what's left of the middle class, and then the rest of the way down the socioeconomic ladder, right? All right. So do you guys have anything else you guys want to talk about or add to what we just discussed?
I don't think so. I think I pretty much covered everything. Heather?
I just like to add now that I don't think that there is an issue more pressing than this. And I think back to that topic of intersectionality, I feel like, as, you know, citizens or on a podcast or wherever we are, we need to be tying everything to this issue because, in my view, there is no other issue because it's all interrelated. So it's a call to action.
Right on. Well said.
Well
Yeah.
said. Stay educated. Fight for a better world. Don't it's easy to feel defeated, but don't let that overcome your revolutionary optimism. It's just what I would say.
Definitely.